Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's June 11th, 2026. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host Ness. We're going to talk about the verdict rendered in the Karmelo Anthony murder trial in Frisco, Texas. Very brief recap of what happened. On April 2nd, 2025, at a track meet in Frisco, Texas, 17-year-old white boy Austin Metcalf was fatally stabbed in the chest by a 17-year-old black boy named Karmelo Anthony, who was a student at a rival high school in Frisco. The two teenagers did not know each other. And what has been established, which is not under much dispute, is that Anthony was sitting under the tent of Memorial High School, Austin Metcalf School, during a rain delay. His school had not brought a tent, so then multiple students, including Austin, told Anthony to leave. Anthony refused, saying, "I'm not leaving, fuck you all." He reached into his backpack and said, "Touch me and find out." Then Austin shoved him. Anthony pulled out a knife and stabbed Austin through the heart, then ran, dropped the knife in the bleachers. Austin died at the scene, reportedly in his twin brother Hunter's arms. And then Anthony asked the police right when he was being arrested whether he had a viable self-defense claim. Flashing forward to June 1st of 2026, in Collin County, the trial began. The judge, John Roach, imposed a gag order and barred electronics from the courtroom. No black jurors were seated. There's some dispute over exactly what happened here. What I've been able to glean is that there were 2 or 3 female black jurors in the jury pool, but during the jury selection process, those jurors were struck. I assumed it was a peremptory strike used by the prosecution, which essentially they can, either party has a certain number of strikes where they can essentially for any reason remove a potential juror from the final jury. There are some exceptions. The most important and relevant exception here is you cannot strike a potential juror solely because of race. The putative reason the prosecution struck these female black jurors was that they were teachers, and I guess there was a claim that they would be biased in some way. They wouldn't be able to render an objective verdict because of their status as teachers. Doesn't really make sense to me. So I'd be very curious to learn more about the circumstances surrounding that, because presumably the defense would have done everything they can to get as many black jurors. Karmelo Anthony's defense attorney was white. We may or may not get to the actual clip, but Karmelo Anthony's father gave an interview just in the last couple days, and he was asked what was his biggest regret during this whole thing. And one of the biggest regrets he gave was, as he put it, being manipulated into picking a white attorney where his instinct was to get a black attorney. But within reason, a defense attorney has to listen to the wishes of his client, and it wouldn't be anything unusual for a client to emphasize to his defense attorney, hey, let's try to get a black juror. So it'd be very interesting to learn what the defense attorney's position was during jury selection and what his reaction was when the prosecution struck the potential black jurors, and whether he did what he needed to do to preserve the issue on appeal, because the Karmelo Anthony team just in the last 48 hours has filed an appeal. I don't believe it's known what the basis for the appeal is, but it'll be interesting to see if they raise a Batson challenge, which is the typical mechanism used to challenge a peremptory strike when it's alleged that it's done on the basis of race.
The Guardian reported that there were initially 600 prospective jurors. That number was whittled down to something in the vicinity of 18, and 3 of the strikes that the prosecution successfully were able to make were of the 3 remaining black jurors in that whittled down jury pool. The defense attorneys that have officially filed a notice of appeal following the conviction have made a formal declaration of intent to appeal rather than a detailed motion, with the grounds expected to focus on claims of self-defense, evidentiary rulings, and allegations of racial bias in jury selection. The father, if we get to it, the father of Karmelo Anthony, is difficult to understand when he's speaking what exactly he is saying or what he is trying to say. But if we are sympathetic and try to steelman what he's groping for that Jeff mentioned previously, it seems to be that he regrets the fact that he was not more emphatic about the need for a black defense attorney who would then presumably understand the importance of seating at least one black juror. This is a county that is 12% black, so the expected number of jurors in a randomly selected pool would be about 1.5. So 1 or 2 is what you would expect randomly assorted. Then on top of that, given access to, you can type it in any AI or Google search or look on X and see there are many memes and graphs about the conviction rate differential by juror demographic and perpetrator and defendant in trials, and black people are remarkably less likely to convict black defendants than non-blacks are, and especially than whites are in cases of violent crime, even more so when the victim is white. Whites, in contrast, show no differential at all in terms of conviction rates, and in fact, some marshalling of the evidence shows that whites are actually slightly more likely to convict whites than they are to convict non-whites, but the differences are marginal, whereas for other racial groups, and in particular blacks, the disparity is striking. And so for the defense to have not made that their predominant concern during jury selection is difficult to fathom. Additionally, the prosecution's striking of these 3 remaining black jurors on account of them being educators is bemusing as well. If anything, the presumption would be that those who have spent a working career interacting with students in an education environment would be better able to suss out the dynamics and identify who was in the right and who was in the wrong than adults that don't have consistent exposure to teenagers would. And so that as a reason to dismiss them. Additionally, it is not as though education is some obscure niche profession that would somehow render their perspectives disparate from that of the general population. It is a pretty common, one of the most common occupational categories in America. And so with the caveat that I have no legal training, at a first blush it would seem as though that would be plausible grounds for an appeal by the Anthony family.
So once jury selection was completed and the trial was underway, the prosecutors called 21 witnesses and framed the killing as a sneak surprise attack, unprovoked and senseless. Student witnesses testified that Anthony provoked the confrontation, refused repeated requests to leave, and said, "I'm not leaving, fuck you all," reached into his backpack saying, "touch me and find out," and stabbed Austin after a shove. Karmelo Anthony's mother, in one interview, stated that the witnesses were all lying and that they contradicted each other. So maybe that'll be part of the appeal as well, although it's not damning to a case if certain witnesses contradict each other in certain ways. It's up to the jurors to assess the credibility of the eyewitnesses. The prosecutor summed it up in his closing statement, quote, "You do not get to meet a shove with a stab, especially if you provoke the shove."
As far as the witness contradictions go, the defense's witness that claimed, there was a defense witness who initially claimed that there was a crowd surrounding Anthony and Metcalf prior to the stabbing occurring, but on cross-examination, he admitted that he had reported that errantly to the police and that, in fact, the crowd that surrounded Metcalf after the stabbing only gathered after the stabbing and not beforehand. And so that was one of the examples of the defense's witnesses undermining the defense's own case. Matt Walsh, who is where I'm getting most of my exposure to this case from over the last couple of days, quipped that it would have been more prudent for the defense simply to have not said anything at all, because in his summation of it, literally every single witness that they called forward ended up undermining the defense case more than helping it. I presume that the lion's share of the reason for that is because Anthony was as guilty as sin, and there was no way that, short of outright lying, that any witnesses would be able to make Anthony's case look any better than it did. But from that vantage point, given that it's the prosecution's job to prove beyond a reasonable doubt or beyond a shadow of a doubt, whatever the threshold is, given that it's the prosecution's job to prove that saying nothing at all would have at least not aided the prosecution's case as the defense was assessed to have done.
It's easy to Monday morning quarterback looking back at a guilty verdict, but in retrospect, it appears that this may have been a fairly rare instance where it would have made sense for Karmelo himself to have testified, because it's hard for any outsider to convincingly give a reason why Karmelo Anthony would feel threatened and why he would bring a knife. If Karmelo Anthony could somehow articulate why he felt afraid or what was going through his head or something, maybe that would have been worth doing.
Yes, given that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, I think now at this point we are obligated to share some of the audio of his father speaking to give an indication of how difficult it probably would have been for Karmelo Anthony to articulate much of anything consistently upon cross-examination. I've also read in the wake of the ruling that for the purposes of potential appeal, that if Anthony were to take the stand and have to testify and be cross-examined, that could be considered an evidence for the granting or rejecting of an appeal. And so by not allowing him to have testified, it would increase the likelihood that an appeal would be successful. But I don't know how much, if any, validity there is to that.
I'm not aware of whether a defendant testifying in a criminal trial has an effect on whether you can appeal. I'm confident in saying that in either case, just because a defendant testifies or does not, doesn't mean you can't appeal or you can appeal. I don't, as far as not, if a defendant doesn't testify, whether that increases your likelihood of winning on an appeal, I don't think so, but I'm not sure.
With regard to the potential ineffective assistance of counsel claim that the Anthony family might make in terms of not being properly represented, AI says that is very difficult to prove, and appellate courts rarely overturn verdicts this way. The only grounds that the Anthony family would probably have would be to say if there was evidence that their defense attorney either coerced or prevented the Karmelo from testifying. So it sounds like that's unlikely, other than if they had intended to appeal, given how bad the case seemed to be playing out in the last couple of weeks. Maybe allowing Anthony to testify in his own defense would have led to him making admissions in the same way that a lot of the witnesses the defense called forward made that would further incriminate him. And so the tactic was instead to potentially salvage any chance of an appeal, that it was imprudent to have him take his own defense. before we get too far afield and leave the excerpt of Anthony's father speaking in the dust, we'll go ahead and play that clip to give some indication of why the defense might have been hesitant to have the junior Anthony take the stand.
And as parents, have you all struggled with guilt, asking yourselves, is there anything differently? I know, Kayla, you said you wish you had gone to that track meet. Is there anything that you both wish you could have done differently?
I wish I would have just been rebellious. I was told, don't talk to this person. Don't talk to this person. I feel like it was just a setup. Now, so they told us, go get white attorneys. Every black person I went to a white attorney. No white attorney, they set them up. Pushed them. Hey, here you go. I mean, no objections. It was things were smooth. So, because as a father of me being who I am, I got to make sure she's straight. This mama bear, I got to make sure she's straight mentally, because if she's not straight, my house ain't straight. I'm not straight. Then, so because I got the kids to worry about. I got to make sure his mental health. I can't go back and forth with him right in there, because his mental can handle it. The misunderstanding of what dad is trying to take. This ain't a daddy moment.
We had the benefit of subtitles and still couldn't really make sense of exactly what he was saying, other than, I think, to be charitable, he felt like he should have interjected more strongly to argue for blacks on the defense and blacks in the jury, and the advice that he received was that he should let the professionals go ahead and handle that, and his regret is that he didn't more forcefully demand those things.
Yeah, that's a remarkably difficult set of words to decipher, but it sounds like somebody, I don't know if it was black people who were telling him he should get a white attorney, or black people who were telling him, no, you got to get a black attorney, and he wasn't listening because presumably someone else was setting him up in some way. It's we've listened to this 3 or 4 times and we are not clear, but I think the bottom line is that he thinks now he should have gotten a black defense attorney, and he should have insisted on doing everything in his power to get as many black jurors. And that's probably true.
Yes, despite us poking some fun at this very difficult to parse word salad that he's uttering, I think Jeff's assessment is correct that, and he may, given that he seems to be more familiar with the jargon in the black community, the way of speaking, and also the associated mentalities therein, that his understanding that he needs black people involved in this, specifically black attorneys and black jurors, was probably a sensible, astute observation for him to make, even if he couldn't articulate it very well.
On the other hand, though, I wonder if his involvement with Dominique Alexander left a bad taste in his mouth. And so this is as good a time as any to reintroduce Dominique Alexander. We talked about him last year, and I should have mentioned we covered this topic in April 2025. We did at least one full episode and maybe like half an episode, and he was prominently featured. So way back in April of 2025, very shortly after Karmelo Anthony stabbed Austin Metcalf, the Karmelo Anthony family brought on board Dominique Alexander of the Next Generation Action Network as their spokesman. And he has a colorful history. He was convicted in 2011 of shaking and hitting a 2-year-old child. He got 2 years probation. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison in 2016 for probation violations. And then he was indicted on felony forgery charges in 2013, arrested on felony theft in 2017, indicted on felony assault in a domestic violence case in 2019.
Those are some impressive bona fides. He definitely has a lot of firsthand experience with the criminal justice system.
So needless to say, Dominique Alexander is black. I would describe him as a discount wannabe Al Sharpton or Benjamin Crump, although Benjamin Crump is an attorney, Dominique Alexander is not. And I think it is interesting to note the complete, as far as I can tell, complete lack of involvement of Benjamin Crump or Al Sharpton in this case. I don't know that they've commented on it very much at all, but it's possible I'm just not aware of it. They certainly were not present, at least as far as I could tell, at any of the legal proceedings or at any press conferences with the Karmelo Anthony family. So I guess they were sort of left with this thug, Dominique Alexander.
Yes, the lack of involvement of the more established race hustling types in this case should have been a tell. I was not cynical enough when the initial press conference from over a year ago that was led by Dominique Alexander, how aggressive and assertive it was and how combative it was towards Austin Metcalf's father, Jeff Metcalf. That, to me, insinuated that there was some conceivable legal case for manslaughter or self-defense or some level of he said, she said, that it wouldn't just be clear as day based on video evidence and all the evidence of all of the witnesses that this was a cold-blooded killing that was not at all provoked by the victim, but to the contrary was provoked by Anthony, the defendant in the case. My guess at the time was that it was conceivable that either Anthony would get off or that there would be a manslaughter conviction, but not second-degree murder or what this was, which was intended murder but not premeditated murder, which is what Anthony ended up being convicted of. Over the last week prior to the verdict being rendered, I had to change my tune there based on what I'd heard from Matt Walsh covering the case. That seemed almost literally incredible in how poorly it was executed and how little standing there was for the self-defense claim to be made in the first place.
The best piece of evidence I can see for a self-defense claim is that Austin Metcalf initiated physical contact. He was the one who first shoved Karmelo Anthony, and then I believe almost instantaneously after Austin shoved Karmelo, Karmelo grabbed the knife and stabbed Metcalf in the chest, or in the heart. And because presumably that would be the best fact to justify a self-defense claim, that would explain why the prosecution ended their case by saying, again, quote, "You do not get to meet a shove with a stab, especially if you provoke the shove."
Yes, well, back to me not being cynical enough. If the argument is simply that a teenage boy shoved another teenage boy, ergo the boy who was shoved had the right to murder the boy who did the shoving, then there would be a countless number of defensible self-defense claims for what would result in homicide all across America on any given day.
So back to that press conference that Dominique Alexander organized in April 2025. And again, this was, I believe, just a few days after the killing. Jeff Metcalf, Austin Metcalf's dad, showed up uninvited. He was wearing sunglasses. And then the Dallas police arrived roughly 40 minutes and told him he'd be charged with trespassing if he refused to leave. And then he left without incident. And I should clarify, this was a press conference put on by the Karmelo Anthony family, presumably to present their side of the story and say, you may have heard a bunch of things in the media, but you may not know all the facts. Slow down and let us have our opportunity to defend ourselves. And so Jeff Metcalf came uninvited, crashed the press conference, was told he needed to leave. He left voluntarily, and then he later claimed that his intentions for appearing at the press conference was reconciliation and joint prayer. Quote, this is a quote from Jeff Metcalf at the time of the press conference. "The only thing I would have said was, okay, can we pray together and show the world we're united?" This putative, magnanimous gesture was predictably from our perspective, met with scorn when Dominique Alexander said that Metcalf had, quote, "felled into bigotry and racism." I guess he meant fell.
Retrospectively, the way he should have framed it was that he showed up unannounced, was asked to leave, and then did so without murdering anyone.
And jumping ahead a little bit, but Jeff Metcalf just did a live stream in the last 24 hours, and he retroactively he referenced this press conference from over a year ago, and he made a somewhat sarcastic comment saying, I showed up to a press conference and I was asked to leave and I didn't stab anyone. Imagine that.
That's funny. We're going to get to it. He didn't insinuate. Does he insinuate that that was his intention, or was he just making a joke about it in retrospect? And Jeff, our home Jeff, his assessment is that Jeff Metcalf did not, at the time, make this connection, did not have the self-awareness at the time to realize the contrast that he was making with how Karmelo Anthony responded to being asked to leave, but only in retrospect, a year plus later, he was able to make that connection.
Yes, my recollection is that Jeff Metcalf was genuine and perhaps naive and believing that he was going to attend that press conference. It wasn't going to be an issue and that he would be able to find some sort of common ground with the Karmelo Anthony family. And as we'll get into, I think Jeff Metcalf has learned the hard way how naive that view was.
Indeed, to think that a white man could come and crash a public offering for blacks by blacks directed towards blacks and take the attention away from them and, to use the terminology, to center the thing on himself, a white man, and take the attention away from the black people who are putting on the press conference is some combination of egomaniacal, delusional, or maybe tactically brilliant, although I doubt that is the case. Or if it were the case, only accidentally so. Maybe there was a providential hand giving him some guidance to making him look like a fool at first blush, but actually doing something that turned out to be quite tactically effective.
So jumping back to the trial, I do want to make sure I address the defense's case. Ness mentioned that one of their witnesses backfired when the defense's own key witness admitted under cross-examination that he had incorrectly told police Anthony was surrounded before the stabbing, whereas surveillance video showed it was after. And as we also mentioned, Karmelo Anthony, the defendant, did not testify. The defense, from what I can tell, stuck to a pure self-defense claim throughout. They said that Anthony reacted in fear and chaos during a split-second moment. And a bit of a mea culpa, perhaps, for the reality taboo. We had predicted back in our episode in April 2025 that the defense would impugn Austin Metcalf's character, would attempt to dig up any dirt. Maybe we thought that he's a white jock football captain. He's probably said made some colorful comments, maybe some racially insensitive comments on social media or in text messages, and that perhaps through the discovery process, some of that stuff would come to light, and the defense would attempt to portray Austin maybe as a racist white kid. But from what we can tell, none of that happened, and there weren't any social media posts, there weren't any racist jokes that were surfaced, there were no character witnesses against Austin Metcalf. The defense did call a track coach who testified that athletes routinely mingled in each other's tents and presumably to support the self-defense framing, making it portraying what Karmelo Anthony was doing as normal, as nothing super out of the ordinary, whereas the prosecution was framing it as justifying Austin Metcalf's behavior and objecting quite vigorously to Karmelo Anthony being in the tent because that is something that is just not done. So that's kind of shows how thin their defense claim was.
Well, that could be a testament to the sincerity and authenticity of Jeff Metcalf's apparent race blindness prior to this post-verdict awakening that he has seemed to have, because if said off-colored remarks existed anywhere in social media that had digital preservation, not that the defense itself would necessarily bring those things up, but certainly the race hustlers and the social media punditry that has been focused on and surrounding this case, and the analysis post-conviction that has been, in some cases, quite hysterical on places like Court TV and CNN, where the argument was that this was a travesty, a miscarriage of justice, and that it was a self-defense case. And it was on account of, I heard multiple people on CNN and Court TV talking about this after the fact that it was an all-white jury, which was incorrect. There were no blacks on the jury, but it wasn't all white. There were non-white, non-blacks on the jury. But then in all of that had Austin Metcalf have made off-color remarks at some point, they would have come up. And so it could be indeed a testament to just how clean that family was and how truly race blind they were, not just in their public persona, but in the hearth as well.
So very shortly after the verdict of first-degree murder was rendered, the jury also sentenced Karmelo Anthony, which I think is somewhat unusual. Most states, the jury convicts, but then the judge is in charge of the sentencing. But I guess in Texas, at least in some cases, the jury also sentenced. So the jury sentenced Karmelo Anthony to 35 years in prison. So now I want to talk more in depth about Jeff Metcalf, Austin Metcalf's father, because Jeff Metcalf is by far the most interesting character in this whole saga to me. He's the most volatile, the most contradictory, the most zealous, in some ways the most human person. And I think we should start by looking at the victim impact statements during the trial. This is pretty common in criminal trials. The victims, and if the victim's still alive, and then if they're deceased, then as well, the victim's family and friends are given the opportunity to give their side of the story or present how this whole thing has affected them. And so Fox News reported that during the Jeff Metcalf's victim impact statement, he screamed at Karmelo Anthony, and court officers had to approach Jeff, but he was allowed to finish. And even at his most unguarded moments, he still clinged to the race disclaimer, to the idea that this is not about race. And I should clarify, Jeff Metcalf is pretty consistently, he hasn't been consistent on a lot of things, but he's been very consistent from the beginning back in April of last year that this is not a racial thing, that he doesn't want to racialize it. The most vitriolic, until we get into what he just said on this live stream last night and somewhat at the victim impact statement. But prior to that, by far, the most vitriol he had was towards white people who were attempting to racialize the issue and present Austin Metcalf as a white martyr and racialize the issue in terms of using this as a microcosm of black violence and whites being victim to that violence. And so back to the victim impact statement, Jeff Metcalf said, quote, "We were robbed. Don't look down. This was never about race. It is about right and wrong." And the "don't look down" part is referring to Karmelo Anthony because he looked down during most of the victim impact statements. And then at some point during that, the victim impact statement, Jeff Metcalf slammed his fist on the table. He said, quote, "People think grief is sadness. It is not. It is rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. You can't even look me in the eye right now, but you can stab my son in the heart. My boys weren't bullies. I've been swatted 6 times, and swatting is when somebody falsely calls in like a bomb threat at your house and basically manipulates the police into showing up at your house and traumatizing you.
Let me interrupt for just a second. That is sanitizing it. The intention of swatting, or at least a potential consequence of it, can be more than just terrifying the person who is being swatted. It can lead to, depending on how that person, what state they're in and how they react, it can potentially lead to the SWAT team taking action against the person that they're swatting up to and including shooting at and killing the person who's being swatted. So these swatting attempts are a potentially attempted murder, or at least the reasonable presumption that could be an outcome.
Yes, and there have been criminal prosecutions of people who swat other people. So back to Jeff Metcalf's victim impact statement. He also said, "My son's death destroyed the person I used to be. He does not exist anymore. You don't belong in this community. A piece of me died with my son, and I'm expected to keep living." And then he also said, You're going to prison. I forgave you the day it happened. I don't forget what you did. The public response sickens me, especially when a gag order doesn't allow me to defend my son. This was never about race or politics, but what you did was to choose to make it about both. We all bleed the same color. And I feel sorry for Jeff Metcalf, but he's a white, either a really young boomer or a really old Gen Xer, as best we can tell. But he seems to really just have this colorblind mentality. And it just seems so naive. This idea that many whites think that everybody, the other races think like they do, that a lot of whites definitely, it appears Jeff Metcalf and his sons really do have a colorblind approach to the world. They don't think race matters. They don't think it has any biological significance, and they don't see any reason to treat a random black person or differently than a random white person, than a random Asian person. And so I just see this as a real wake-up call for Jeff. It seems like very disorienting, existentially terrifying, because in many ways his entire worldview is being torn to shreds in front of him in the context of his own son being murdered. And even through all that, he appears to be desperately clinging to this colorblind mentality.
Yes, he almost gets there, and as we'll cover subsequently in some of the remarks that he's made after this victim statement and after the conviction was made, where he is you can almost treat his son in this case as a metaphor for his race-blind, universalistic understanding of the world. And when Anthony killed his son, he also, it looks like, also killed that race-blind understanding, naive understanding of the world. And it's something he's fighting against multiple occasions. He has, even in what Jeff just recounted there, in multiple instances, he is almost seeming to reassure or try to hold on desperately to convince himself that this has nothing to do about race, but it's almost like you can sense that he's protesting too much. Like he's trying to hold on to a faith that he feels slipping away, that is dying.
Just in the last 24 hours, so the evening of June 10th, I believe even into the early hours of June 11th, Jeff Metcalf appeared on a 3-hour live stream hosted by journalist Sarah Fields. And she's someone who has covered the Austin Metcalf trial extensively. So this was posted on X and Rumble. It was Jeff Metcalf's first opportunity to speak without restriction since the gag order was imposed at the start of the trial. So here is Jeff Metcalf just in the last 24 or 48 hours.
Drew Anthony, Kayla, you're cowards. You wouldn't even show up for your son's sentencing or victim statement impact. You abandoned your kid. You left him there. I guess he's no more use to you because you can't get any more GoFundMe money or go send Go money. You are grifters. You should be ashamed of yourself. You raised that child, and I swear to God, CPS to come check on those other 3 that you still have. You never once admitted or took accountability. You tried to play victim. The real victim is the one who died, not the one who shoved a knife in his chest. I come to pray with you and show the world we can close the gap of this unbelievable racial divide. And what'd you do? You widen the gap even further. You hire a convicted, baby-shaking felon who's only in it for the money, who gives you bad advice, kicks me out of a press conference. Oh, funny, I was somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, but I left when asked. I didn't stab anyone. And then you proceeded to gaslight me with your convicted felon, quote, advocate? Minister? Minister of what? Minister irrelevant? Minister of bullshit? How about Minister Fuck You? Y'all think I'm a saint? I'm no saint. I'm as human as you. I have emotions. Just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean I don't sin, because I don't walk on water and I don't turn into wine. And anybody else can, step up. Don't become kicking rocks in my backyard. Look in your own. The display of adults on the internet. If your children saw how you acted, would you be proud? Or is that what you teach them? Do you teach them that racism is okay? Do you teach them? Do you program your kids to hate, to kill? From day one, I said this was never about race. Please don't make it about race and don't politicize it. And what did you do? You chose both. The race card, black fatigue, it's real. I'm sorry. You have embarrassed your own culture and race. Don't get me wrong, we got white people that embarrass the shit out of me too. But you guys, you got a patent on that shit. And the only people that's going to change it are you. Don't blame the white person, because we can't change it. But you're going to blame the white person for every fucking thing else. I'm going to tell you right now. Charleston White, you think you're funny? We'll see who's laughing. Drew Anthony, you're a pussy and a coward, and you raised one. Kayla, you drunk bitch. What'd you do to that boy to make him stab somebody? My God, what kind of mother are you? Hey, Kevin Hayes, you fucking liar. Day after it happened, how many lies did you sit and type up on your keyboard, you big keyboard warrior? You a big tough man. You still live in Baton Rouge? Remember you said you'd come to Frisco, buddy? You're supposed to find me. I told you we could sit down and talk. That's all you do. Talk, Mr. Squeaky Clean. He's the only one in your family without a damn record. I guess that's something to brag about in your culture. You people hang your hat on the dumbest shit I've ever seen. Let me make one up. Y'all can let me make something racist up so y'all can go viral. I got a new name for Mello, okay? Because he was such this little boy y'all were trying to portray. How about Watermelon Felon? How's that one strike you? I hope he enjoyed his first night in that cell last night, because he's going to have many nights to think about what the fuck he did. I forgave him, so I don't carry the hate and the anger. How poetic justice is served. You just do a big softball and knock it out of the park. Thank you for making it so easy for me. So you can live with your lie if you want to, but my truth is forever. Just like the fact your son is a convict and a killer. Forever. Forever is a long time. What's your master plan, Mr. Anthony? To use your son as income and soak up as much money playing victim to line your pockets and then abandon him when he's at sentencing or victim impact? You just left him up there by himself? Amazing. Amazing. What about you, Drew? What kind of father are you? You want to talk about what kind of father? All right, let's talk about what kind of father you are. Let's talk about your arrest. Let's talk about your warrants. Oh, was it drugs? Coke? You did? Tell me some other shit. Let's pull it up. Because I'm welcome every one of you to pull up my criminal history. Someone who tried to make up some bullshit saying I'm a sexual assault person, guess what? If you're convicted of sexual assault in Texas, you have to register. Please check the registry. Please check my background in criminal history. It's not there.
A couple things before we dig into what Jeff Metcalf said there. There's a lot there. He referenced a few people I'm unfamiliar with, at least one person down in Baton Rouge who I guess he had some sort of beef with. I'm assuming there's some of these black social media people who were probably slandering Austin and Jeff. I'm guessing that might be who he's referring to, but I'm not sure. The people I do know he referenced there were Drew Anthony, Karmelo's father, and Kayla Anthony, Karmelo's mother. And I did look into whether Drew Anthony had a criminal history. I was not able to find anything, so I'm not sure if Jeff Metcalf was just slandering him there or if he had actual reason to believe that Drew had a criminal record.
Yes, it is worth noting those names are quite standard middle-class American names. They aren't the stereotypical LaQuisha, Tanisha, DeBrickshaw type of names. It's Drew and Kayla are the parents' first names. Karmelo is more of a stereotypically black name, but given also that this is a pretty affluent area of Texas and that the couple is married, and looking it up, they've been married for 17 years, it's not inconceivable that he wouldn't have a criminal record.
Jeff Metcalf did make, in my view, a pretty ostentatious display of piety at the beginning. Back in April of last year when his son was killed, he made a public display of forgiving Karmelo Anthony. And I can't help but think that was virtue signaling, because the behavior he displayed in that live stream is, in my view, is not consistent with somebody who has forgiven the killer of his son. Perhaps the most jarring part was when he labeled Karmelo Anthony as watermelon felon. To be fair to Jeff Metcalf, I think he was doing that in a somewhat ironic way, saying, kind of performing the idea that he's been unfairly maligned and called a racist, and here I am, a guy who I've gone out of my way to not be a racist, to even go after white people who are trying to racialize this, and then after all that, I'm still called a racist. Well, F you, I'm going to be a racist. That was kind of the vibe I think he was going for. I don't think he was actually vitriolically using a racial slur. I think he was doing it in an ironic way.
I think it could be a little more nuanced than that, or that he may not be sure exactly what he is saying. It very much sounds like a man who is having a crisis of faith on multiple levels, a crisis of faith both for his race-blind, universalistic approach to human biodiversity, effectively, not that he would characterize it that way, but that is playing out in addition to some crisis of faith in his Christian faith. And I have good news potentially for him, that he can jettison both the equalist, race-blind nonsense that has grown up in parallel with the modern inverted version of Christianity that we refer to as churchianity here, that has paralleled that growth in an absurd understanding of race being meaningless in a secular sense. But fortunately for him, there are millennia of Christian history where the understanding of how race and ancestry and genealogies does very much matter in a secular sense in terms of how things play out in the created world. It is not something novel. The curse of Ham, that is something that has several centuries of Christian scholarship surrounding it. And I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, but not necessarily fully so. I think there is very much the ability to be red-pilled about the realities of human biodiversity, to effectively jettison the taboos in understanding what makes humanity what it is and the differences in human action, human performance, human attributes, and a more serious, historical, unapologetic Christianity. And it sounds like he is having a crisis of faith, and that will, I'm sure we will talk about it with regards to what we covered when we first broached this trial over a year ago, where one of the things that we assessed was that there would be that Jeff Metcalf was effectively, in his outward proclamations, worshiping a false god of equality and no racial differences, and thinking that that would somehow redound to his spiritual benefit. And now we see that he is still, after all this time, realizing that he's been totally forsaken by that false god. And so him being able to jettison that false set of beliefs, that false churchianity, and also the false belief in a secular sense that there are no racial differences among groups of populations and that they don't manifest in any way. It feels like this is a guy going through a crisis of faith where both of those false beliefs might be jettisoned in tandem. And another reason I think it is a legitimate crisis of faith that he is experiencing there is because he is, as his old beliefs fall away, he is displaying the zealotry of a new convert as he's trying at one hand to try to hold on to these old mantras about how race has nothing to do with it, but then at the other hand, coming up with all of the, effectively the real world articulations of the 13 to 50 meme and the didn't do nothing meme. He's interspersing those things with these increasingly unconvincing proclamations that race has nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, he's talking about all these things that would be very much recognizable among race realists as criticisms, as long-standing criticisms and critiques of how the black community in the West performs, how it manifests itself.
Yeah, and actually, I want to play a bit more from that Jeff Metcalf live stream because I think it'll relate to what Ness was just talking about.
But you'll jump on the side of a murderer for skin color. Do you know how stupid that really makes you look? I'm going to support somebody blindly, even though they did wrong. You're going to support someone who does something against the law. You're encouraging and saying it's okay because he's a certain color. Oh, you've got more melanin than me. Ooh, so you get more in privileges, more entitlement? Because 400 years ago, someone actually sold you to us, and we took you over here and put you to work. And then we had a civil war to free your ass. And now you want to talk, oh, I've been so oppressed. You couldn't even vote 1960. Look how far you've come. Look at all the free shit we give you. You're not oppressed. You're entitled. You know what DEI stands for? Yeah. It means I don't have to be qualified. I just have to be a certain color or race or gender. Whose bright-ass idea was that? I don't know about you, but when I grew up, there was no participation trophy. There wasn't a safe space created for me because my feelings were hurt. We had to take actual responsibility for our own actions. Wow, what a concept.
This is coming from a 3-hour-long stream that is something like a stream of consciousness. There is someone who is interviewing him, I think, that's been cut out from all of these clips, but to reemphasize the point, this very much sounds like someone having a crisis of faith and acting or speaking with the zealotry of a new convert, someone who fought so hard against seeing things in racial terms, and now that the scales have fallen from his eyes, he is saying things that a lot of veterans for decades in this arena, this intellectual arena, who would be called by the high status managerial state culture would be called racist, or saying like, hey man, settle down a little bit, you're going a little bit too far.
It's also an incredulity that people would base their whole worldview around race. And another tell is he says, and you would base how you treat someone based on how much melanin they have, and that just betrays a very surface level view of race. This idea that we're just like color swaps, that the only difference between a sub-Saharan African and a European is they have a different skin tone, which it's kind of hard to believe, but I think that really is among people like Jeff Metcalf, the baby boomer, early Gen X generation. That's really what they think race is, that's how they're able to have a colorblind worldview, because if you think race is just a social construct and it's the only actual tangible difference between races is their skin tone, then yeah, it would be incomprehensible why you would determine, whether you think somebody should go to prison or not based on their melanin, versus what Jeff Metcalf doesn't seem to have understand. Maybe he's starting to understand it, that race goes a lot deeper than that. And African Americans have always understood that. And for most of American history, whites have understood that. It's only in the last, probably the baby boomer generation and on, that they haven't understood that.
Yeah, the civil rights revolution, or the onset of the Nuremberg regime. But to reclinate back to a theme that is a recurring one here, status in the modern West is very much hinges on at least paying lip service to that belief that race is only skin deep. Now, simultaneously, the belief system, a newer intrusion that someone like Jeff Metcalf probably wouldn't endorse, but that has been kind of layered on top of that, is while race is skin deep, also white people are uniquely evil and always out to oppress non-whites. But in terms of, especially with regards to whites compared to non-whites, the thing that people have to constantly in public to maintain good standing, to keep their jobs, to keep their positions of authority, is to pay lip service to what our Jeff is understandably ridiculing as these absurd beliefs that just simply having eyes and noticing what's going on would seem to undercut. And yet at the same time, everyone has to constantly maintain this fiction in public. And so not everyone is inherently trying to find that red pill. In fact, most people are just trying to conform to whatever set of social beliefs they're supposed to conform to maintain good standing. And so that is what the publicly stated beliefs that most people have to have are the things that are falling away from Jeff Metcalf's eyes now. And that is a long-winded way of, again, emphasizing that he seems to be going through a sort of conversion experience where his old false faith is falling away in real time in front of our eyes and to our ears in pretty spectacularly entertaining fashion.
To underscore what Ness is saying there, I'm going to go to James Burnham's Machiavellians real quick. Couple quotes. The rule of the elite is based upon force and fraud, and the cohesion of society demands the acceptance of myths. And there's perhaps no greater myth or fraud than the idea of racial egalitarianism, the view that Jeff Metcalf seems to believe, that there really are no differences between races other than such incredibly superficial things like skin color. We've been discussing a lot of red pills. I do want to throw out at least a potential white pill from my perspective. The judicial system in the United States and the West more broadly has rightly come under a lot of criticism. However, I think in this particular case, the judicial system worked more or less exactly as it should. There was a trial. Both sides were able to present their side, and in our view, at least, the correct verdict was rendered. Karmelo Anthony is going to spend the next at least unless the appeal is successful or something dramatic happens, he's going to spend the next decades of his life in prison. Ness and I are trying to make sense of Jeff Metcalf and his perhaps transformation, or perhaps bringing to the surface what was always there. Because in my read, the race blinds, this is not about race, and I forgive Karmelo Anthony, that whole posture is completely inconsistent and, in fact, in my view, contradicted by his somewhat vitriolic vituperations during the live stream we just played. And there's so many different ways you can interpret that. I guess my initial one is the holier than thou public performance, virtue signaling, ostentatious forgiveness, and insistence that this isn't about race. I think that was always a fraud. And now that he has been just beaten and gone through a horrible tragedy, losing his son, and the gag order has been released, and he's just finally unleashed. He doesn't have to contain. He doesn't have to put up a facade anymore. And this is what he's always believed. He's had much more of a based, somewhat realistic view of racial matters. Although, as I'm saying that, it is somewhat contradicted by he still seems to really believe that race is just skin deep and that it doesn't really matter. So I'm not really sure. What do you think, Ness?
If he were red-pilled all the time, though, I don't know why he would continue to be interspersing the mantra, the refrain that this has nothing to do with race, and it only has something to do with race now because you people made it about race. But he continues, as I've pointed out ad nauseum at this point, but I'll do it one more time, that this is someone who appears to be going through a struggle, a crisis of faith, of his old faith, but he's still trying to hold on to it. So if he was really just letting loose and letting off the chain, I don't think he would feel the need to continue to interspersed with these sort of boomer racist observations. Interspersed, even as he's delivering those, he's still filling it in with claims and essentially professions of belief in this not being about race and this not being about differences, and wanting to bridge the gap rather than push it wider. And so I think a more charitable, or more at least authentic reading of what Jeff Metcalf is doing is that he has understood that he's not totally naive. It's not like he's never heard these, what he would have viewed in the past as bigoted comments about non-white behavior, about black behavior, and all of these different stereotypes. But from a race egalitarian perspective, he looked at these as sort of challenges to the faith, that nothing that the devil ever does, to put it in very starkly religious terms, nothing that Satan does is a complete, blatant, obvious lie, but tends instead, as sin always is, to be a perversion, to be a corruption of something that has some element of reality and some truth in it. And so he was aware of these attacks on the faith, but he was able to parry them and keep them at bay and continue to stay strong in his faith. But then when his faith really did crack, or is in the process of cracking, all of those beliefs, or all those things that he thought were false beliefs that he's now realizing were more true than he thought, well, they're all just vomiting out. They're cascading out in a waterfall. And there is a pretty funny Simpson comparison to this with Ned Flanders in an episode where he is portrayed as a modern Job who is going through his own crisis of faith. And for those uninitiated with The Simpsons, Ned Flanders is a very neighborly, salt of the earth Christian who famously never has a bad word to say about anyone. And the way his character is written, he genuinely believes that, and he works to reinforce that on a daily basis. And yet when his faith cracks, in the same way that Jeff Metcalf's observation racist 4chan tier observations are spilling out, so does Ned Flanders' observations, very unneighborly observations about all of his neighbors, spill out when his faith cracks. The lead up to this scene we're about to play, Ned Flanders, his house is destroyed in a hurricane, and it's revealed that he doesn't have homeowners insurance because he interprets that as a form of gambling, and that's how pious a Christian and neighborly a person he is. And so the town of Springfield comes together to build him a house for his family to live in, and it's shoddy and it's starting to fall apart, and it parallels with Ned's own faith starting to fall apart because he's been such a devoted Christian all his life, and it seems like God's punishing him in the same way that God punishes Job. And so this is how he reacts as his faith is cracking.
Can't you morons do anything right?
Hey, Ned, we meant well, and everyone here tried their best.
Well, my family and I can't live in good intentions, Marge. Oh, your family is out of control, but we can't blame you because you have good intentions.
Hey, back off, man.
Oh, okay, dude. I wouldn't want you to have a cow, man. Here's a catchphrase you better learn for your adult years. Hey, buddy, got a quarter?
I am shocked and appalled.
Mr. Flanders, with all due respect, Bart didn't do anything.
Do I hear the sound of butting in? It's gotta be little Lisa Simpson, Springfield's answer to a question no one asked. What do we have here? The long, flabby arm of the law? The last case you got to the bottom of was a case of Malamars!
Malamars, oh, that's going in the act.
Oh, yeah, the clown. The only one of you buffoons who doesn't make me laugh. And as for you, I don't know you, but I'm sure you're a jerk.
Hey, I've only been here a few minutes. What's going on?
You ugly, hate-filled man.
Hey, I may be ugly and hate-filled, but what was the third thing you said?
Homer, you are the worst human being I have ever met.
Hey, I got off pretty easy.
In the final assessment of Jeff Metcalf's actions, when we covered this over a year ago, we talked about the expected value, the outcomes, probabilistic outcomes that Jeff Metcalf could be managing when he went front and center with his insistence that race had nothing to do with this, and he was trying to minimize racial tensions and the like, and how he responded with almost unhinged or seemingly unhinged vitriol towards Jacob Lang, who was ostensibly singing praises about his son and understanding what Jeff Metcalf was going through. And Jeff Metcalf displayed more anger towards Lang at the time than he seemed to towards the Anthony family, or even to Karmelo Anthony, the killer of his son. But from a true believer's perspective, he probably thought, and correctly, I think in this case, that if he were, or his family's case was in any way associated with Lang or Lang's beliefs, that would hurt the chances for his slain son to receive justice. And in that way, I think his calculation turned out to be correct given the circumstances. This is about the most just outcome that could be expected in 2026 post-Christian America. Now, Karmelo Anthony is sentenced to 35 years, eligible for parole in 17. Genesis 9:6 commands Christians that whenever a man spills the blood of another man unjustly, that he is to be put to death. That is a Christian command in the first book of the Old Testament. And so in that way, maybe justice is not fully served, but given the contours of the time, 2026 America, this was, again, about the best outcome that could have been expected. And whatever the authenticity, the sincerity of his beliefs that he has held up until this point, up until maybe the last 24 or 48 hours, it does seem that his initial desire, at least from my read, was to get justice for his slain son and protect his remaining son and ex-wife to the degree that he could by directing a lot of the focus that was directed at the Metcalf family, having that all come, or as much as he could have that targeted at him. He had mentioned that he'd been swatted 7 or 8 times, however many times, but it's also been reported that his ex-wife and his other son have been swatted a couple times, and there's been lots of social media posts about how the other son needs to be killed, and there's been threats against their lives in addition to against Jeff Metcalf's life, and they've been doxxed. And so that, even with Jeff Metcalf being the focal point and receiving a lot of the fire and ire of the Black Anthony supporters, even though he's taken the brunt of it, his other son and ex-wife are still receiving some of it. So it looks like he took a lot of that fire that would have rained down on them. He had directed towards himself by making himself more of the focal point. And I think it looks like, especially in light of how things played out, that was pretty admirable on his part. And now he may, although he could not have conceivably intended this at the outcome, this Damascene conversion that he seems to be going through with his false faiths falling away and his true faiths being revealed in front of him, he may actually be able to benefit in a secular, material way by becoming the hilarious online racist uncle type that he seems to have quite a knack for, given this 3-hour live stream that we've been excerpting from.
I have a less charitable read of Jeff Metcalf, although this statement that I'm about to read I prepared prior to the live stream, and so I haven't fully processed. The live stream was a curveball that I just saw this morning, and it's made me potentially rethink my assessment of Jeff Metcalf, and it might be almost premature to render a assessment because he seems to be changing quite rapidly in front of our eyes. So maybe check back with him later, but I'm going to nonetheless give my assessment of Jeff Metcalf basically up through the trial and before the live stream. Jeff Metcalf performed Christian forgiveness and racial universalism publicly and consistently for 14 months, debasing himself before a cultural apparatus that rewarded him with nothing but scorn. Alexander called him a racist anyway. The Give, Send, Go hit 630,000 anyway. The appeal was filed anyway. The verdict he received had nothing to do with his posture. It came from clean facts and an aggressive DA. He would have gotten the same outcome staying home and saying nothing. The facade cracked repeatedly before the final collapse, calling Lang's people white trash while forgiving his son's killer, showing up uninvited to the killer's family's press conference and requiring police removal. None of it matched the composed, theologically grounded persona he was projecting. The sentencing outbursts, screaming, fist on the table, officers approaching, race disclaimers still firing automatically mid-rage, was simply the moment the brittleness became undeniable. Meanwhile, Megan and Hunter did none of it. No performance, no theology, no racial disclaimers, no public posturing. They were simply what they were. A mother and a brother who lost someone and said so plainly. Megan's statement was clean and devastating. Hunter's was raw and direct. Both landed harder than anything Jeff produced in 14 months. They never claimed to be beyond the grief, so they never had a facade to lose. In the final accounting, Jeff humiliated and debased himself before a God that doesn't bless his supplicants, received scorn from the side he was propitiating, alienated the side that would have embraced him, lost his composure at the worst possible moment, and was quietly shown up by his ex-wife and surviving son, who simply told the truth.
Yeah, so that if that assessment is the case, well, the outcomes are the same either way, other than Jeff Metcalf's lost dignity, such as it is, though it does look at least... Now, this could all change. He could come groveling back in another 24 or 40 hours and renounce everything that he just said in the previous 24 or 48 hours, but I think in terms of being compelling content and being able to get focus on himself and away from the mother and brother of his slain son, if that were the goal to some extent, he seems to have achieved that at least. Though it is a counterfactual, I do think that were the Metcalf's cause able to be positively married to the white advocacy of Lang, that would have potentially caused a problem in terms of the outcome. Other than that, I agree with the assessment that this didn't seem to really influence the outcome one way or the other. We've talked about the Metcalf's outcome, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't also mention the outcome for the Anthonys, the parents, to the extent that their outrage was genuine as opposed to performative or simply based more on what it meant for them individually rather than what it meant to their child, who is now going to spend at least the better part of a couple of decades in jail. I think it was telling when Kayla, the mother, when she was asked what she regretted, it was that she wasn't at her son's track meet, which is a little bit interesting as a parent myself. Sometimes things do come out, but you really do try to make an effort to be at all of their events. And I think this is a recurring through line that Jeff Metcalf mentioned all the way to the victim statement and the sentencing at the end, that they weren't there for that either. Who knows how absent they were as parents through their children's lives up to this point. But while their son is going to be away for a couple of decades, they are $700,000 plus richer. And if he ends up spending 17 years in jail, even if they don't raise any more than they have so far, and then he gets out as a free man in his late 30s, well, making $700,000 over less than 20 years is probably better than he would have done if he were just out in the labor market. After raising over $600,000, the first Give Son Go drive was ended, but Kayla, the mother, has opened up a new one. We mentioned 2 over a year ago when we first covered this as another iteration of the so-called ghetto lottery, where something happens, some either victim or perpetrator in some sort of bad incident in the Black community happens, and then because of the response not being exactly as it should be, the state or the city or some municipality ends up paying out a bunch of money for a wrongful conviction or wrongful arrest or some sort of maltreatment, and the survivors of either the perpetrator or the victim or both end up making out very well, even though the one person has to suffer for them to make out that well. A more familiar instance of this in the last 5 years was, of course, George Floyd's family, who was awarded something like $27 million by the state or by the city of Minneapolis in the wake of his overdose death. And so something similar here is playing out, albeit not exactly the same way. It's not the state, but it's going to be through the form of public donations being made to the Anthonys. So this is another long-winded way of saying that although Karmelo is going to spend some decades in jail, his and his family's outcome is still much better than what is the outcome for the Metcalfs, who lost a son and a brother. And I was going to say didn't become any wealthier for their troubles, but Jeff points out that the Metcalf family, through 2 different Give Send Go campaigns, also raised about $700,000 for funeral expenses and magnanimously a scholarship in Austin Metcalf's name, and then also potentially a future war chest for legal challenges that arise down the road.
That'll do it for us. Thanks for listening. Talk with you next time.